because you may be ready to lose your virginity, but maybe your partner isn't, and you should never pressure anyone to do something that they don't want to do. That goes with saying, when I lost my virginity, a guy said no 3 times and I still hopped on it, so you're asking the wrong person.
The social construction of sex offenders as male presents a gendered approach of the subject, which provides grounds for further examination. Emerging reports on female sex offenders should inform changes in the overall depiction and perception of sex offenders. The reports counter popular belief of minimal to no harm in sexual offenses perpetrated by women. This video does not seek to minimize male perpetration of sexual offenses, but to acknowledge the gender dynamics in sexual victimization. Altering perceptions should be accompanied by changes in representation in the justice system. In general, Embry and Lyons explain that justice systems are more lenient towards women compared to men, which fails to reflect the reality that women could also be sex offenders. This explanation violates the parity principle that advocates for similar sentencing sanctions for similar crimes. Sentencing guidelines are tailored to promote proportionality and uniformity in treating defendants solely based on legal factors. The guidelines promote fairness and honesty that reduce disparities associated with social characteristics as required in the 14th Amendment of the Reconstruction era. However, fixed sentencing reforms, including formal guidelines that focus on sentencing disparities, raises issues in the justice system. Dorner and DeMuth explain that the persistence of gendered sentencing, which raises questions on formal guidelines, is associated with various factors that reduce the concern for the related outcomes. First, there is the generalization that women have been historically discriminated against, thereby causing harsher sentences. Second, the societal and judicial depiction of criminals as men presents women as deserving of leniency because they present lesser reoffending risks. Finally, women's social roles as caregivers account for the reluctance of court actors to sentence female offenders. The factors that reduce the attention on gendered sentencing create a notable tension between the uniform implementation of the law based on legal factors and accounting for gender-based differences that inform differential treatment. Sentencing guidelines address this tension by allowing the discrete use of departures that facilitate the consideration of factors such as familial responsibilities and ties in sentencing outcomes. The approach to handling disparities differs in various jurisdictions. In England, an appellate court only intervenes in gross sentencing disparities, while the courts in Australia are not restrictive since they intervene if disparities are associated with injustice. Damiris and colleagues argue that disparities in punishing offenders impact the victims of the crime because the seriousness of the outcomes is minimized. Most victims seek retribution through offender punishment for the harm caused by the crime. Justice systems are reluctant to break social norms by sentencing women and men in similar fashion. Systematically identifying the discrepancies in gendered sentencing requires extensive examination of the sex offender populations. Ireland, Ozan, and Ireland observe more similarities between male and female sex offenders than differences. The similarities should equally inform sex offender management in societies, otherwise, even research results are distorted. For example, sex offenders comprise a large population of individuals with mental health conditions. The conditions stem from childhood trauma that is transferred to adult relationships through assault or abuse. Offenders also tend to target close victims, including friends and family members. These similarities should be explored in making sentencing decisions as an approach to minimizing the sentencing disparities. The similarities cannot be accurately documented due to a shortage of tools to assess female offenders. Analyzing sentencing disparities in the context of sex offenders and offenses in this video is guided by the association between the underlying behaviors, social norms and gender roles. Theoretical foundations that account for gendered differences in sentencing include the patriarchal perspective, the chivalry hypothesis, the evil woman or selective chivalry hypothesis, or the double deviance, and cognitive dissonance. The foundations warrant extra attention on sex offenses, which is the most common crime, portrayed as a departure from gender roles and social norms. Men being raped by women is unimaginable to many people, and some believe that sexually victimized men cannot be upset, of course, compared to women. Societies often present sexual offenders as a unique category of criminals characterized as dangerous and unable to undergo rehabilitation. Criminal laws have projected these perceptions by increasing the liabilities associated with sexual offenses. Efforts to punish sexual offenders, especially in cases involving children, have significantly affected research and policy formulation. There is limited evidence on specific aspects of sexual crimes, the offenders, and criminal processes. For instance, little is known about how sentencing decisions are arrived at and the influence of offender and crime characteristics on decision-making. Gender significantly influences the approaches to punishing sexual offenders, including the weight of punishment. Men are perceived to be over-sexualized while women are under-sexualized. The sexualized perspective of men and women is reflected in increased male status and worth through sexual experience, while the vice versa is true for women. Sexual involvement of a younger male with an older female is technically glorified and welcomed, since it is viewed as gaining sexual experience. Men are generally the initiators of sexual activity while women are passive participants. Females are often projected as nurturing, sensitive, and emotional, while men are deemed to be emotionally passive. These emotional differences affect decision-making, with men utilizing the justice perspective and women using the care perspective. Chase argues that men's definition of self is based on achievement and status, which informs abstract reasoning by judges. Women focus on interpersonal relationships, which guides the intrinsic nature of decision-making. The construction of criminals in most societies and jurisdictions depicts men as the typical sexual offenders and predators. These sentiments are echoed by James L. Mathis, who commented, and I quote, "Women are viewed as sexually harmless to children. What harm can be done without a penis?" This societal perception matches actual offending to a certain degree. Hassard Walker, Leitano, and Di Benedetto maintain that most perpetrators of sex crimes are men, a phenomenon that informs the view of female sexual offenders and the offenses as less threatening or harmful to the victims. This view reduces the implementation of approaches that could deter offenders from reoffending. Gannon and Cortini maintain that the social construction of women guides their perception as sex offenders as unthinkable. The sensational approach utilized by media to document sexual abuse has informed the public perception of sex offenders. Public perceptions of harsher sentences and minimal rehabilitation for male sex offenders is a concerning phenomenon. The concern is associated with the fact that therapy-based treatment in female sex offenders has significantly reduced reoffending rates. However, the same is not being applied to male sex offenders. There has been a significant reduction in the incidence and prevalence of sexual violence over the past 2 decades. The drop in sexual violence has been accompanied by increased attention to victimization and sexual violence by the public and the media. This attention is associated with the perception of a rise in sex crimes over the recent past and the fear concerning the threat of sex crimes, especially against children. Societies construct sex offenders as male predators who assault women perceived as incapacitated. The outcome of the social construction is the viewpoint that male sex offenders are more dangerous and that the outcomes are more severe. Shields and Cochran note that public opinions on gender and sexual offending are applicable in various sexual offenses, despite that female sexual offenders also target children with little regard for their gender. This unique characteristic is complemented by greater variations in the victim's age regarding female sex offenders. Stempel, Flores, and Meyer explain that female perpetrated sexual abuse range from non-consensual oral sex, vaginal and anal penetration using objects or fingers, and intercourse. The authors also argue that women are more likely to commit same-sex sexual victimization than men are. However, the offending window amongst female offenders is smaller compared to male counterparts who start earlier and continue to beyond the age of 60. Less gender-based discrimination in the context of female sex offenders increases the likelihood of victims being female. Cases involving child victims are reported through Child Protective Services, while those involving adults are documented by law enforcement. Minimal reporting of sexual abuse is associated with the fact that it happens in private. Stemley, Flores, and Meyer note that confidential surveys present a greater prevalence of female sexual perpetration. MacLeod argues that female sex offenders are more likely to target their biological children, close relatives, and children under their care, especially those with physical disabilities and drug-related problems. This phenomenon is associated with increased access to the victims because of the traditional caregiving roles. Victims of male offenders include neighbors, friends, relatives, and strangers. Gannon and Cortini document some authors who actively present women as incapable of sexual assault. For instance, Freund and colleagues negate the existence of pedophilia among women, while Dinov comments that paraphilia does not exist in women. Anderson explains that female sex offenders have increased likelihood of assaulting children under the age of 6 years, with statistics showing that the offenders account for less than 10% of individuals incarcerated for perpetrating sexual crimes. Besides, the National Incidence-Based Reporting System uncovered that female sex offenders committed over 40,000 crimes against children between 1991 and 1996. Ireland, Ozan, and Ireland explained that the type of sex offence is an important consideration since abuse is beyond contact sex offences. This explanation gives rise to contact sex offences and sexual exploitation such as prostitution and victimization. Sexual exploitation comprises a unique group of offenders who present different characteristics from male offenders. The behavioral, physical, and mental health consequences on victims are similar for offences perpetrated by men and women, as will be outlined later on in the series by Weir. Sex offender characteristics are complex to the extent of involving women. The shortage of female sex offender information is associated with the typical representation of sex offenders as male and the low numbers of documented female sex offenders. For instance, Ireland, Ozan, and Ireland note that there are only 13 studies on female sex offending between 1989 and 2004. 5 of the studies did not make any comparisons to differentiate the characteristics of female sex offenders. The authors also characterize studies with poor methodologies and a lack of distinctions between various types of abuse. Lack of clear sexual abuse or offense distinction fails to account for underreporting incidents such as coercing children into prostitution, which is not perceived the same as prostitution. Stempel, Flores, and Meyer note that female perpetrated sexual victimization is less likely to be reported than sexual crimes perpetrated by males. Cortini, Sandra, and Freeman explain that women are overrepresented in promoting prostitution of a minor. Other factors that affect the quality of studies on female sex offending and criminality in general include poor analysis due to suppressed sex effects, poor construction of dependent variables, the lack of control variables, shortage of female cases, and telegraphic data interpretation. Most victims of female sexual offences are children, and as such, they cannot be involved in studies. Gannon and Cortona note some issues related to research designs, including data collection methods, target populations, sexual abuse definitions, and the language used. The data collection methods often used present conflicting information on the true picture of female sex offenders, thereby minimizing the blameworthiness of female sex offenders. For example, the choice of the target population, daycare facilities, and preschool institutions would yield different results, as will be presented later on. The definition of sexual abuse determines respondents' answers in painting an accurate picture of sexual abuse. Most studies ask the gender of the sexual abuse perpetrator, with investigators linking sexual victimization to male perpetration. The non-threatening social construction of women presents young men victimized by women as actively involved in the crime. The difficulty of estimating the prevalence of female sex offending is associated with 2 reasons. First, Ireland, Ozan, and Ireland note that female sex offending is both poorly understood and significantly underreported. This underreporting is further worsened by the over-focus on women's backgrounds, which are mostly dominated by mental health issues, to reduce the effectiveness of sentencing. Significant underreporting of the crimes is also because of the widespread societal view of women as passive and incapable of causing harm. This view separates males and female sex offenders in terms of characteristics, profiles, and behaviors. Estimation difficulties are associated with a lack of awareness by the victim or close contact with the offender that victimization is hidden in everyday actions. For instance, sexual offenses might occur when a caregiver is bathing children, which is never reported in most cases. Massive underreporting is also caused by disbelief, where offenders are thought to misinterpret offenders' actions. Hayes and Carpenter argue that sentencing clarity is adversely affected by assumptions on the subjectivity of sex crimes and questions on the underlying harm for male victims, even when they are minors. Second, female sex offenders are diverted from official sex offender punishment, which eliminates the demographic from official statistics on sex crimes. MacLeod reports that the minimal recognition of women as sexual offenders leads to limited treatment, tracking, registration and prosecution. However, based on the nature of the offenses, studies such as MacLeod's estimate that females account for anywhere between 1 and 20% of all sex crimes. The sex crimes include rape, statutory rape, sexual assault, child sexual assault, and forcible sodomy. There are significant disparities in officially reported sex offenders and available victimization data. The nature of sex crimes also determines approaches to reporting. The number of women arrested for rape is significantly lower compared to other types of sex crimes. MacLeod maintains that up to 20% of child sexual abuse perpetrators are females, since the perpetrators often target children, yet female sex offenders account for 1% of the justice system. 1 in every 5 substantiated sexual abuse cases against children is perpetrated by a female offender. This phenomenon presents a significant breakdown in systems that should protect children as the most vulnerable population. Finkelhor, Ormrod, and Chaffin observe that juveniles commit a third of all sex crimes, with 7% of juveniles who commit sexual offenses being female. Cortona, Babe-Kishin, and Ratt explain that juvenile females are more likely to commit sexual offenses compared to their older counterparts. These phenomena explain why female sex offenders' victims are children under their care, which is significantly different from their male counterparts. Anderson explains that 88% of FSOs are teachers, while 23% are caregivers. The choice of victim is one difference between male and female sex offenders. An additional significant difference noted by Ireland, Ozan, and Williams and colleagues is the rate of co-offending. Williams and colleagues explain that female sex offenders are more likely to co-offend, with solo offenders showing greater signs of mental health problems and relationship issues. The relationship issues include sexual dissatisfaction, low self-esteem, personality disorders, intimacy deficits, relationship problems, and loneliness. Mental health problems include anxiety, depression, borderline issues, and schizophrenia. These mental problems are more severe compared to those noted in male sex offenders. Mental health issues, co-offending, and harmlessness are traditional viewpoints that contribute to the perceptions that women cannot offend willingly. The problems result in poor emotional regulation that manifests in the inability to cope with one's children and a neglectful parenting style. Trauma is presented as a mitigating factor for female sex offenders, but it is largely ignored for male sex offenders. Anderson explains that female sex offenders are more likely to target the same victim repeatedly. Chase explains that mental health problems are significant contributors to filicide. Apart from mental health, additional factors that increase the risk of maternal filicide include low economic status, a young age, unmarried status, addiction, and a history of abuse, as documented by Stempel, Flores, and Meyer. A study completed by Bickett, McLaren, Grady, and Stoller uncovered that most of the offenses by the respondents entailed the victimization of available minors with the help of a male co-offender. The study also revealed that 60 and 40% of the participants had histories of sexual and physical abuse. The use of weapons by female sex offenders indicates active involvement in the crime, irrespective of the presence of a co-offender, which breaks down the assumptions that the presence of co-offenders directly translates to women's involvement in a passive role. According to Rosen and Friedersdorf, the National Crime Victimization Survey of 2013 uncovered that 38% of the sexual assault and rape victims were male. The 2010 National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention found, and I quote, "Women were vastly more likely to experience abuse perpetrated by men, as were male victims who were penetrated without their consent." But among men reporting other forms of sexual victimization, 68.6% reported female perpetrators, the paper reports, while among men reporting being made to penetrate, the form of non-consensual sex that men are much more likely to experience in their lifetime, 79.2% of victimized men reported female perpetrators. A similar survey by the Bureau of Justice Statistics between 2010 to 2013 reported, and I quote, "Female perpetrators were reported in 34.7% of incidents with male victims, and 4.2% of incidents with female victims. Inmate-on-inmate sexual assault was found to be 3 times higher in female prisons compared to male prisons." Also, Rosen reports that 89% of detained juveniles reported sexual misconduct perpetrated by female staff members. Considering incarcerated victims of sexual victimization is important because of the power dynamics at play. Stempel, Flores, and Meyer observed that prison staff members completely control inmate lives, including visitation, work assignments, educational opportunities, cell assignments, and other privileges. Prisons are single-sexed with staff duties carrying sexual power. The duties include monitoring showering sessions, patting searches, and conducting strips. The power dynamics of sexual assault is greatly supported by the feminist theory that present victimization is a product of power. Incarceration status, sexuality, race, and gender significantly influence the interaction within prison systems. Friedersdorf notes that victims of sexual crimes perpetrated by women are often reluctant to report, and male victims are expected to interpret victimization along masculinity ideals. This expectation is termed as the lucky boy syndrome by Weir, where forced sexual experiences are interpreted as enjoyable since the men did not have to work for sex, as is traditionally the case. Rosen explains that the revised definition of rape, and I quote, includes victims who were forced to penetrate someone else, with their own body parts, either by physical force or coercion, or when the victim was drunk or high or otherwise unable to consent. When those cases were taken into account, the rates of non-consensual sexual contact basically equalized, with 1.270 million women and 1.267 million men claiming to be victims of sexual violence.